Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Tank, episode number 23. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'm going to be hosting for you today. Happy Father's Day to all of the dads out there, all the listeners, and extra special Happy Father's Day to the two biggest daddies I know. I'm not talking about people with kids either. We got Christopher and Teld, who are individually either feeling sick and or have an internet problem, so we're gonna have a fun recording today. It sounds like we're super enthusiastic. How you guys doing this morning?
I just want to say that anybody who would call me daddy should seek counseling.
Yeah, I've been really excited for this episode, but today is a day for sure.
Yeah, the sacrifices we make for the listener, right? And that's a complimentary daddy, of course. You know, nothing but the best for you. What we're going to discuss today is combat tricks. You've seen the title, obviously, and I have to admit that I approached Chris and Teld and I said, can we please do a short episode? After doing back-to-back reviews of Modern Horizons 3, like 3.5 hour long recordings, I was like, okay guys, we have to do something short for this next episode. So we're going to talk about combat tricks today. I will say I got some YouTube feedback from the latest reviews that we did, and I've heard a couple of comments, and I can officially say that we are going to try our best to put out some more peasant content specifically for set reviews. So I would say the peasant review of Modern Horizons 3 was successful. I got a good feedback from it, and we are going to try to do more peasant reviews in the future, even if that's the only peasant content we do. I had fun doing it. I didn't have fun editing it after doing another 3-hour edit of the mainline review, but I did appreciate the feedback that I got on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube right now, just go ahead and hit the like button. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It helps quite a bit. Before we get into the meat of the episode, also want to remind everybody that you can join us on Discord. That's where we do most of our organizational stuff. That's where we do our drafts. So find the link to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this, and come join us. Give us your feedback about the Modern Horizons 3 stuff. Come draft with us. Come pitch us your cubes and let us know what we should be drafting on Arena. But the Discord is a great place to be, to just hang out with some like-minded individuals. We also have our Brawlbarians League. I think we're in League number 7 right now, which Teld has deemed the I'm not touching this with a 5-foot pole league, but we are in the midst of yet another league with some stipulations, and if you like building brawl decks and playing brawl decks, then you should come join our Brawlbarians League. All you have to do is click that Discord link and say, hey, I'm here for Brawlbarians. We'll guide you to where you have to go.
Yeah, I'll be back to Brawlbarians when all of the Nadus and Ajanis of this week are put out to pasture.
Oh my god, Ajani especially has just been
Are you facing that one down in Brawl?
a lot. It's starting to like approach auto scoop territory.
Oh, that good?
It's just like it's one of those things where like it's not like the condition is like when a cat dies. So when you can build a deck when you always have it on turn 2 and all the creatures in your deck are cats, like it basically the card says like interact with my card that I keep redrawing that's only a 1/2 and don't interact with anything else or I will flip. And oh, by the way, every time you interact with this, I'm going to redraw it, and because it only costs 2 the first time, it's going to stay relatively cheap. It's just, yeah, it's not a fun card to have to deal with multiple times when a deck is built around it.
And consistently coming out on the second turn of the game every single time, yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's just a lot. It's a bad heads-up commander card.
And you get a Boros deck with that too, right?
Mm-hmm. It's a red-white color identity, Yep. I guess I've been making this mistake with a lot of Modern Horizons 3 cards, not to go too deep down the rabbit hole here, but we evaluated a lot of cards over the last couple weeks for Cube, and then I started playing them in different environments, and I was like, wait a second, these take on a completely different meaning. So a Johnny, for example, never really considered it with other cats, right? Because we don't play cats in Cube. Guide of Souls, that little 1-drop that makes energy when you attack and lets you pay energy to put like counters on a creature and turn it into an angel, give it flying. Never once considered that card in the context of other energy cards. Because in our cube, like, we didn't care about energy at all. But my god, that card is asinine in Limited, where someone goes turn 1 that, turn 2, anything that makes 2 energy, and there are a lot of cards that do it, and then you're just getting hit by a 3/4 flyer on turn 2. And then next turn, they attack again. They probably played another energy card. You're getting hit by 2 3/4 flyers. Just absolutely egregious. And then, of course, I had a whole bit planned for this, but I'm not going to do it. But Chris, we have to talk about Chris. Like, I don't want to go super in depth on it, but the Writhing Chrysalis, the common, the like game warping best card in the set common from Modern Horizons 3 is just an absolute travesty of Magic design. Like, I don't know how that slipped through.
People have been talking about it, and I don't know. I could be sold that it's stronger on average than Bloodbraid Elf is.
Could be. Yeah. Hot take Mike Sigrist. Mike Sigrist on Twitter said, learn how to play around commons, get over it, which I thought was a very weird take on a card that literally everyone... Take. Yeah.
Like, what are you supposed to do to play around this card either? It's
That's what I said. I normally don't respond to stuff like that, but like, shouldn't you be giving people advice on how to play around it if it's that easy, instead of saying get over it to people who are clearly upset about this thing that's like ruining a format that they were very excited for? That seems like a very like terrible stance to take, but I mean, to each their own, I guess.
Did he design consult on the set like he has on previous sets?
That's the first thought I had too. The people who are like defending Nadu, they probably like had some sort of input on how Nadu was designed. But yeah, man, Modern Horizons 3 has been a awesome set with just a handful of these egregious cards that are just running rampant in different formats. But we should not get into Nadu right now. We should not really get into Writhing Chrysalis, but I don't think I could go a whole episode without complaining about it at least once. So consider that your one complaint.
I do find it funny. My one comment is like, Writhing Chrysalis's win rate has gone down a little bit, but it's not because the format is adjusting per se, so much as that you are just now mirror matched into Writhing Chrysalis so frequently that its win rate had to drop 1% or 2.
Yeah, man, just to play around my 2-mana 4/5 reach that I have.
It's much better than that in the context of the limited format. It is most of the time like a 4-mana 7/8, and if you have a second one, you have multiples of those. In limited, or in like Cube, where we're playing it, we played it last night, and it was very, very good, but it was not like game defining, crush the game when it resolves. But in the limited format, where you can play like Malevolent Rumble and Glimpse the Impossible and all these other cards that make Eldrazi spawns, it is like legitimately just a million with reach that also keeps you from going. That keeps you from beating by going wide. Like it's completely ridiculous.
Yeah, I'm assuming that you guys have not warmed up to the format since we last talked about it.
I've had zero desire to play this format.
The blue-black deck I had last night that actually ended up trophying was like a push in the right direction for me, so maybe there's a little bit more room to explore. But I think, honestly, and I would normally not support this, I think they should bite the bullet and they should make a digital change on that card, whether it's bump it up to uncommon or actually change the card, and just accept the fact that they made a huge design mistake that's going to warp that limited format throughout the entire summer and push people off of the format. And they should just own up and say, hey, this is a design mistake. We are trying to do something to rectify that. And we're going to make this one digital change. We're going to accept the fact that it's not one-to-one with paper and we screwed up. Like, they should just do that. And people, of course, will be like, oh, look what WotC did. What a bunch of dummies. But, like, the alternative is people just don't play your format for the summer.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the one time I would agree with that. First of all, Writhing Chrysalis is at a win rate that is like, it is of the win rate of the best mythics or rares of any set at common. It's got an IWD, like an improvement when drawn, of just astronomical. It's huge. It's certified bomb territory at common. In paper, I think it is slightly less bad, only because the set is so expensive that not a ton of paper drafts are going to be fired on average. And I know that's not a fair thing to the people who pay for the set, but like, so many more games are played on Arena in this particular set than you could ever play in paper. I think that this card is like legitimately threatening to ruin a format. I thought Inspiring Overseer was amazing. Obviously Organ Hoarder was incredible, but they did not break the format in half the way that Chrysalis does.
No, it is egregious design mistake that makes you scratch your head and say, how did this get through? But to cut that short, because we do have a single card discussion that we actually want to get to that's not this game warping limited common. Before we talk about the single card discussion, I did want to mention that Chris had the idea, since we're talking about combat tricks today, and combat tricks are not the type of thing that you actually see in high-powered cubes too often. Chris approached us with the idea of making this kind of an ongoing series. Not something we're going to do like literally episode in, episode out, but you see the title has the subtitle of Challenging Heuristics. Yeah. Talk to me about that real quick, and then let's go ahead and talk about our single card discussion, because you think there are kind of a category of cards that people avoid, or just like as a firm statement say, you know, these cards don't have a place in Cube, and we think that there's a little bit more to them, right? That's what we're talking about as far as like challenging heuristics and, you know, card types that could go in Cube that people maybe should evaluate individually rather than just have blanket statements about.
It's a little broader than that. In a couple of different forums, I've seen people make statements about not just card types, but deck types and archetypes, etc., that have just essentially been like, well, X thing does X, or X thing has X problems. And I think that's partially a function of there just being things that are sort of like traditional wisdom. And this is true in like Magic in general, not just Cube, but people will cleave to ideas about concept X in Magic, and then I think it's maybe at least in part because a lot of cube curators aren't able to actually play their cubes a ton, but these ideas about card types or things in Magic kind of like outlive their usefulness. And I think with combat tricks in contemporary Magic, we're like getting there. But like the thing that really prompted me to consider this as like a broader idea is I was having a conversation with somebody on Reddit, and they said, well, we were talking about White Orchid Phantom, the white 2/2 flying first strike that blows up a non-basic land. And they made the statement, your monocolored aggro decks punish your multicolored greed decks, so you don't need a monocolored reward that does that. And I think like in like a broad sense, theoretically, like, yeah, your lean monocolored aggro deck punishes your greed deck in this sort of this theoretical space, but that assumes so much about what your multicolor decks look like, how much removal they have access to, how good the fixing is, how powerful the cards in the monocolored aggro deck are, etc., etc. Like, conceptually, I understand where they were coming from, but it just kind of made me realize, like, there are ideas that people hold about dynamics in Magic and Cube that are just sort of like, quote-unquote, time-tested heuristics that aren't necessarily true. Sorry, that was long-winded, but you see what I'm saying, right?
No, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, when a lot of people just broadly talk about Cube, they're kind of like secretly talking about vintage Cube unless you specify that you're talking about something else, right?
Right.
And most of the time when we talk about Cube, we're talking about like creature-centric, you know, modern level, power level, non-combo Cube, which is quite different, you know, and is going to have a different home for combat tricks and stuff like that. So one thing we're not doing here is talking about, you know, why you should play a bunch of combat tricks in vintage Cube. We're talking about why, you know, combat tricks have a place in cubes where creature combat is a defining feature of that cube. Yeah, let's jump into the single card discussion, like our actual single card discussion here. A card that I know you guys have been quite high on, to the point where it feels like a new deck has emerged in our own format, just kind of incidentally because of cards like this and because of the combat tricks we have available. I am going to throw this one to Teld because I know he's a huge fan of the card, and also because like he's sort of sick, so it's kind of like funny to get him to read the cards out a little bit. But Teld, talk to me about our single card here.
Yeah, so the card we're going to talk about today is Repulsive Mutation, which is the MKM gold card. It is a blue-green X for an instant, and you put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, and then you counter up to one target spell unless the opponent plays mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. So this card, at its base, is kind of is like a mana leak variant. It's in that stubborn denial, like you need a creature in play, but it disrupts your opponent kind of card. The big upside on this one is kind of twofold. Obviously, if you have like a big creature, this is just going to tax them so much that most spells are just not going to resolve. And then secondly, because the X, you can funnel a bunch of counters onto a creature, which can do either making a creature big to allow it to attack, which is incredible with blue evasive creatures or green trample creatures. And then also it allows you to just leverage the powerful creatures that are played in green and the evasive creatures in blue, I guess would be the short of it. This card, I actually remember us talking about this during the MKM episode and thought that this card was probably not going to be super good. I remember Chris had mentioned it as a card that he was interested in, more in the context of like a pure flash deck. And I think the sort of style of deck that we're going to talk about is like the modern equivalent of a flash deck is where this best goes, but it's not really a flash deck per se. It doesn't do the flash thing the way that traditional flash decks do with like Frilled Mystic. But this is kind of the card that you're playing in there. And I think you want to leverage this card by using the 2-mana mode most often. One of the tricks that people get blown out in this card is just trying to funnel all their mana into a card and then getting blown out on it, you know, by like their opponent having a removal spell and then being able to pay like 2 mana because that's the best creature you had left or something like that. You want to leverage this card where you're going to get value out of it being just like an overcosted mana leak or an oversized mana leak, right? You've got like a 4/4 or a 5/5 and you make them pay. But the fireball function on this card also means that a lot of times people just get blown out or die out of nowhere if they don't play around it. It's just a card that like hasn't had a lot of respect initially in the cube, and I think people are coming around on it because it's just blowout after blowout every time we see it.
I don't think that this was originally on the show notes for the MKM episode, and I added it.
Yeah.
And I think what I said was that if Simic Flash was ever going to be like a really functional deck, this was the kind of print that we needed to see for it. And I do think that like in a pure Flash deck, this is like obviously really great, but it has demonstrated time and time again that it doesn't strictly like have to be in one. You get to a point in the game in a lot of green decks where like just because you have unspent mana doesn't broadcast anything because you've ramped enough that you just have a bunch of mana and you're not always going to be able to spend it every turn. So having mana open doesn't scream, I'm holding a counter spell. The other thing that's interesting about this card is that it's kind of like made me reevaluate when I build my Simic decks whether or not I will put counter spells in them. Like, I used to kind of think if I was going to build a Simic deck, it was going to be, like, a green deck that had, like, Time Warp and Goose Mother in it. But one thing that this card has sort of got me thinking about is that putting counter magic in your green deck, it is another way to leverage ramp. And what I mean by that is, like, you can ramp into, you know, a turn 5 play a couple turns early. But alternatively, what you can do is you can ramp into like a 3-drop play a couple turns early while also having enough mana to hold up like negate or something. And that quote unquote accelerating out, basically like using your ramp to play your threats on what would traditionally be on curve, but also holding up stack interaction simultaneously is actually a valid plan for winning with the green deck.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the strengths where this card lies too is I mentioned the deck that we've been really trying to seed. We have a joke name for it, but I think that's what we're going to stick with, of Bant Cocaine or Simic Cocaine. And it just like because it just looks like the most weird, like you had to be on drugs to draft this deck when you see it, but then it plays really, really strongly. And I think where the flash comes in this deck is that cards like Repulsive Mutation or Trash the Town require you to hold up like 2 or 3 mana, right? Your Tyvar Stand wants you to hold up 1 to 2 mana. And the cheap blue flash creatures actually play really well into that. You're not looking to hold up like 4 for like Nightpack Ambusher or Frilled Mystic or things like that, I don't think. I think generally speaking, the flash aspect of the deck is like you're going to use your ramp if you're playing it to play out like a 3 or a 4 drop ahead of schedule. And then, you know, be able to play like a 3 drop, hold up 2 or 3 mana, and then you have the option of like, I'm going to play a combat trick or a counter spell or my flash creature with like that little bit of mana I had left over. And I think that's the flash element of the deck, but that's kind of the way it's felt when we've played it.
Yeah, totally. Like, we played some test games with like a theoretical build, and one of the strongest things that the deck could do was like play a dork on turn 1 and then play Bristly Bill, play a land, and then hold up Spell Pierce and then untap and, you know, just putting something on board like a Quirion Beast Caller that just kind of grows in size and snowballs while you protect it is powerful. And I've absolutely won games with Repulsive Mutation where it was just like the last card in my hand and it was just Fireball on a flyer to win the game, like make Malcolm a 6/5. So yeah, one of the things we're actually going to be talking about this more extensively in a little bit, but like what basically makes this card so powerful is like, yeah, it's counterspell, but yeah, it's also fireball, and yeah, it's also kind of both, and it's that modality that makes it so powerful.
Yeah, and I mean, put it on the quadrants, right? Or I guess a more realistic way to approach that is like, how good is it behind parity and ahead? The three that really matter. If you are at parity or you're ahead in a game, this like walks up the game majority of the time. Your opponent is going to not resolve their next spell, and you're gonna increase your board presence, assuming you have a creature on board. If you're behind, that's where it actually like falls behind a little bit, but even then you still have the mana leak mode, and as long as you have a creature on board, you're probably going to get a 1-for-1 out of it, even if you don't like blow out your opponent or something like that. So like the fact that this just like cinches games that you're already winning or you pushed ahead a little bit, like I don't know, it's a little bit demoralizing to play against if you know your opponent has it. Like they could just straight up show it in their hand and be like, I have repulsive mutation, and like you could just concede some amount of the time. That's how it felt in limited, at least. I haven't actually played with or against this in our cube, but I know you guys have a little bit of experience. I know you guys are pretty high on it right now, and it doesn't seem like the rest of our community has really latched onto it quite as much yet. But
I think people are coming around, because like what I think, I might be repeating myself, but like when I've played with the card, like you look at it, you analyze the board, and a lot of times in green decks, because your creatures just like outsize everything, the only way that you can lose from having a dominant creature board presence is like a Wrath or a removal spell or something like that. Like your opponent's not beating you on board, so they've got to have something in their hand that either erases your board, invalidates it, or changes the context of what's going on board. And a counterspell just prevents that from happening. You know, if it's turn 3 and I manage to like make a 4/4 or make a 4-drop play, and then have the comfort of knowing like anything that you attempt to do next turn is not going to happen. From there, sometimes the 4-drop just wins the game.
Yeah, for sure. I think one little tip with this card would be also to recognize the matchups where you need to hold on to this card, even though you have an opportunity to cast it, versus the matchups where you just need to jam it the first opportunity. Because there's some decks, like, you know, if you're playing against, I don't know, like a black deck or a red deck, sometimes like you just have to jam it on the first card they play. Sometimes against control, you have to jam it on the first card they play, and sometimes you have to hold it for a Wrath. It really rewards recognizing like what are the cards that beat you, or what are the cards your opponent would reasonably have. Like if it's pretty likely that they can kill your biggest creature with like a cheap removal spell, for example, and then be able to like make this card fizzle or something, like you obviously just take it the first time that they tap out. And if you're holding it for a Wrath, obviously you like really don't want to do that on anything that isn't a Wrath, because you know that's the card that beats you. So this will get into this, but I think these combat tricks that they're printing now really reward recognizing like when you can create the opportunity to use it, and then leveraging that to its maximum to get a lot of value out of the card.
For sure. And the flavor text is so doofy. It says, remind me to send the Biomancer team a gift basket. It's just like,
yeah, pretty weak.
Okay, what are we doing with that text? But
the card is not, I promise. Like if you have a creature oriented environment, which let's be honest, most non-vintage cubes are, this card is deceptively good.
Yeah, something to compare it to before we move on is what's that blue-green modal spell that's like mana leak / fight spell? Decisive Denial, I think is what it's called. Like if that's a card you've ever considered in the past, which is obviously a Simic card that like is part counterspell or part fight, which you're putting in your like blue-green creature-based decks, right, to make use of those modes. If that's something you've ever considered, this is just like a way better version of that card. I guess it's not straight up creature removal in the sense that like a fight will be, but as far as like a modal counterspell / board presence affecting card, this is an amped up version of that. But combat tricks, we'll go ahead and get into combat tricks here. A little bit of a loose discussion here. I think we're just going to kind of broadly talk about them and, you know, piggyback off of each other's thoughts here. But I did want to just open this up by asking you guys, like, what exactly do we mean when we say combat trick? Are we talking about specifically stat boosting effects, or are we talking about just anything that can affect the way a combat turns out? Like, for instance, a blink effect or a fog effect or something like that? Or we just power increase in effects across the board? Is that what we mean when we say combat trick?
I just want to like chip in here real quick and say like we didn't say like combat tricks and fights and bites because it's too much. I'm thinking about mostly cards that require you to have a creature on board to have an effect. And generally speaking, they're going to impact what happens when the creature gets into combat. But I think people are down on combat tricks traditionally for the same reason that they are down on like fights and bites. And I think the big concern, generally speaking, is blowout potential.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we say tricks, the way I'm thinking of is these are cards that have to be able to impact combat in some manner. So, like, I don't know if I would consider a blink spell a combat trick per se. It is a tricky card, but it's not going to really impact combat other than like being able to remove your creature from combat. And I don't really know if I don't really think that's what we're talking about. I'm generally referring to like what you might call traditional combat tricks, things that, you know, are going to let you do something in combat to win. They're going to protect your creature. They're going to make your creature bigger. They're going to, you know, do something like that. Yeah. And I do think traditionally, the biggest thing on that is, people don't like them because you can potentially get blown out with an instant speed removal spell, because we always assume that your opponent has the removal up and the mana to cast it. It's the perfect Doomblade in their hand. So like we just assume all of those things.
But they always do. They have it every time.
Your opponent's always on black. They always have 2 mana up. They always have it in their hand. So, I mean, we're all, I think as Magic players, we're all familiar with that being like the starting point of any discussion about a card where that can be a possibility. So, and it's what I call the Doomblade fallacy for all the reasons that we just outlined. Like, those things just are not always the case. Like, especially in the earlier portion of the game, if your opponent's on a proactive deck, the reality is that they're going to be tapped out most of the time. The other thing is, like, there are plays that you will make that have high upside in Magic in general that have play patterns that are very similar to a combat trick. So, just referencing Doomblade again, like, it's not an uncommon combat situation for someone to attack and have mana up, and you're looking at whether or not you want to double block, because theoretically, if you double block, like, you're only going to lose one of your creatures, right? So that's like a fine trade. But you have to be concerned about whether or not your opponent is just going to remove one of those blockers at instant speed and then get both of your creatures. Like, that's effectively a combat trick, if that makes any sense. And there's also, like, when people represent mid-combat sort of creature ability plays, like on-board tricks, so to speak. So these are not combat tricks in and of themselves, but what I'm just trying to point out is that there are high upside plays that we make as Magic players that effectively what we are representing is a combat trick, even though a removal spell is not a combat trick. Which is all to say that sometimes making plays like that is the right thing to do, and they have the same potential pitfalls as a combat trick does.
Yeah, I think one question that Magic players need to ask themselves too, because we can't, I mean, like, I think it is fair to say, like, if your opponent has a removal spell, this happens and this is bad. But if you're going to make that argument, I think you also have to have the other side of that coin, right? And say, what happens when your opponent doesn't have the removal spell? And that's where a lot of these combat tricks come in, is like, if you set them up in spots where your opponent doesn't have the removal spell, the ones we're going to talk about that we're playing are all super high upside. They like almost win the game on their own.
Yeah.
Well, that's also part of the reason that we're talking about this in the first place, is because people see that blowout potential, you know, the situations where you can pop a creature in response to a removal spell and you get completely blown out. But that's not something you really have to think about in the average cube very much. And we found that adding that layer of combat tricks to combat in general, but also to a cube in general, just gives players more things to think about, right? Like, a lot of times you can boil down even a cube like ours to threats and answers. Like, the majority of games are going to revolve around what's the threat that's resolved and what is the answer that's going to take care of it, or vice versa, right? Like, sometimes you're in the role of like, oh, I need my answers to line up against my opponent's threats, and you don't really think about too much other than like, how am I going to deal with the problems that are posed in this particular game or match? And combat tricks, I find, adds a third layer that you usually don't have to think about, right? Because if you're in the middle of combat in our cube right now, you know, take away the combat tricks, like, all you really have to think about is, does my opponent have a removal spell or do they not have a removal spell? If they don't, then this is how this combat's going to go. If they do, this is how this combat's going to go. But when you factor in, like, something that you saw in the draft, it could be a repulsive mutation, it could be a trash to the town, it could be anything like that. Now you have to kind of weigh different options. It's not just, does my opponent have the point and click removal spell, but it's what happens if they have the removal spell versus what happens if they have the combat trick versus what happens if I have the combat trick. So I think it just adds a slightly more interesting, I think, layer of combat. Maybe some people don't actually find that sort of thing interesting, to have to think about another thing in the middle of combat or another thing that can affect the way a combat goes. But I find personally that combat tricks add an extra layer. I mean, imagine a limited format that doesn't have combat tricks, where it's just, lining up removal spells versus creatures. I think you lose something there. When you add the combat tricks in, things get a little more interesting. I don't know if you guys actually find them interesting or not, but I assume we all do, since we're talking about them.
No, I agree. I think it's Andy from Lucky Paper Radio, I believe, on the show, has said on a couple of occasions that he's a fan of when combat tricks get there, because generally speaking, historically in Cube, the idea is that they don't. So the only thing that you have to think about in combat is whether or not there's a removal spell in your opponent's hand. Like that's the only consideration other than what's on board. And having some combat tricks in a cube that actually get there, they add tension to combat that it previously, like in a lot of cube environments at the rare plus rarity restriction, were just not something you ever had to think about, if that makes any sense. So it's just like you said, it adds a different dimension to combat that is historically absent from more powerful cube lists.
Yeah, tension's a good way to put it. I think more tension, in my opinion, usually leads to more interesting games. Not always better games, but more interesting at least. And I'm a personal fan of adding more tension to cube environments, but some people are opposed to that. Some people just like, you can decipher exactly what your opponent's going to be able to do and have the strategic advantage that way. I think it's personally more fun to have to think about more different angles, more different things that could happen. And that's just a personal approach.
I was going to say, if I had to guess, I think that the difference there would be if you see Cube as really good limited versus bad constructed. And what I mean by that is that there's always been two schools of thought with Cube, of like, should your Cube decks look similar to constructed decks, or should they look more like really, really powerful limited decks, using rares and bombs and all that? And like, I think if you're of one of those two mindsets, like, the limited mindset, I think, is more interested in the combat tricks, and like the constructed mindset, since they don't show up very often there, maybe you're not as interested in that. And I don't know if that is like still a designation that works in modern Cube, but it is something I remember thinking a lot about at one point in Cube. It was just like how some cubes looked like they were just bad constructed decks.
I think an interesting example that kind of highlights the tension thing that we're talking about is, once upon a time on our list, the thing that 4 mana in a blue-white deck typically represented when you were going to combat was that they were holding Settle. And then we got Wandering Emperor, which punishes a very different combat decision, and then Resto Angel, which punishes other decisions. And so, like, when you go to combat, once upon a time it was like, this kind of feels like a Settle the Wreckage, but then you were in a situation with the addition of those other 2 cards where it's like, okay, well, the texture of what's going to happen when I do X is going to be really different if they have Settle or Emperor or Resto, and now I have to like think about those, and it's not comfortable as the person.
It is not.
Making
People hate that.
Yeah, it is tension. It is tense. It's not comfortable being the person making that attack decision, but it's a lot more interesting than, okay, I'm going to do this because this is the way I get the least punished by Settle if that's what's happening.
Well, in the same vein, too, it's the type of card, combat tricks in the same vein as it's like Settle the Wreckage. I think they're really interesting cards for cube environments, too, like in the draft portion, because you can kind of track where they are and stuff like that as well. Like, it's way more tolerable when you know an opponent has access to Settle the Wreckage, right? In a cube environment, you could just yoink the Settle the Wreckage, and then none of your opponents can have it. Mm-hmm. So you get that sort of edge, right, if that's something that you just lose to. Same way with combat tricks too, right? Like you can track Monstrous Rage, a card I think we're going to talk about here. Like if I have the Monstrous Rage, there's no way my opponent could have the Monstrous Rage in a singleton cube, so I no longer have to track that information. Likewise, if I saw it in my first match and I go to another match and I'm playing against another red aggro deck somehow, there's no way they can have the Monstrous Rage. So I think it's another piece of information that you have floating around a cube environment that you can get an edge on by just kind of keeping in mind who could not have these combat tricks. And, once you put an opponent on a possible combat trick, you can play around it accordingly. Team drafting is something that's actually happened a couple times in the last few weeks, we get some 6-player pods. I'm like, okay, why don't you guys just team draft? And they're super into it. Combat tricks are a good thing to track in a team draft, right? Like, oh, I have Monstrous Rage in my pile, so you don't have to worry about playing against Monstrous Rage against your opponents, like that sort of thing. So I think it makes like drafts a little more interesting outside of gameplay, as far as just like tracking the information and the type of things that the opponents you're going to run into could not have, the same way you would with something like Settle the Wreckage. And I'm not saying you should hate draft combat tricks necessarily, but just having that little bit of information I think helps a lot as well.
Yeah. By the way, Tim, I love yoinking things.
Yeah, we well, back to that daddy comment, but
I just love it when Tim says yoink. He's the only person that I know who does it, so I savor it every time.
You know other people who say yoink. I can't be. There's no way. It's no way I'm the only one. Maybe it's a dad thing. I don't know. Maybe only dads yoink. But
maybe only dads yoink.
So
happy Yoinkers Day. Happy Yoinkers Day.
Happy Yoinkers Day. One thing I wanted to ask you guys, what is it that makes a combat trick cube worthy? Because we're talking like abstractly combat tricks, but we're not advocating for playing giant growth, right? Like we're not saying, oh, you should just be playing like these temporary effects that like pump your creature, win a combat, and then move on with your life, which is the majority of combat tricks. And I think when people think of the term combat trick, like the kind of like platonic ideal of a combat trick is like giant growth. 1 mana +3/+3. I'm going to try to win a combat with this, use it as like pseudo removal. That's not what we're talking about. What do we need to see in a combat trick for us to consider it in Cube?
So you have 3 things listed here, and I think I generally agree with them, though I think one of these is substantially more important than the others. So there's modality. Right, the ability to have multiple modes. So Repulsive Mutation was one we mentioned. It has the modality of being kind of a mana leak versus like a fireball, or both, or however you want to configure it. In Peasant, there's cards like Revitalizing Repass and Legion Leadership that are lands, but also combat tricks. And then there's like Raw Efficiency. I think these tend to be some of the really good ones, the power cards. So Embercleave and Monstrous Rage are both good examples of this for different reasons. Embercleave can be really efficient, but its big draw is that like if you resolve it and your opponent doesn't have anything, most of the time you do literally just win on the spot, or your opponent is put in such a position they can't win. And the Monstrous Rage is on the other side, where like it frequently isn't going to win the game on its own, but it's like 1 mana, push a bunch of damage and win a combat. So it's just hyper efficient. And then what I think is the most important is the staying power. So tricks that leave behind something. So this is what I think all except for, funny enough, what I think might be the best of the bunch do is they give staying power. So Monstrous Rage leaves behind the trample and +1/+1 on the creature, assuming it survived the combat. Embercleave stays stuck to the creature. Repulsive Mutation leaves behind counters often enough. Trash the Town could draw cards, leave behind counters. The only one that doesn't fall into this that we play, and I guess here in a minute we should probably mention all the ones we play just to have a list, because we probably should have started with that, but is Tyvar Stand, and it gets by mostly on the raw efficiency category. It's just such a powerful, efficient effect while also being stapled to a fireball that it's really good.
You guys actually need to talk about Tyvar Stand a little bit more
so
right here, because I heard Teld mention it yesterday that you guys were calling it one of Green's best cards, period. And
I think I'm there.
Talk to me about it, because I think this is one of those cards where you'll be like, oh, my opponent has Tyvar Stand, I can't win this game.
Yeah, so real quick, just to mention we've mentioned them all at various points, but just to put it in a list, the combat tricks that we play that would fall into that category in our cube would be Tyvar Stand, Repulsive Mutation, Embercleave, Monstrous Rage, and Trash the Town. I don't think I missed any, right?
No, you didn't miss any. I would. It's not a combat trick, but going back to like including the occasional fight/bite, I would kind of include
Primal Might.
What? Primal Might, yeah, because Primal Might is a fight spell, but it's also a fireball, and then on some boards it's kind of both, right? Because like on a trampler, like if you just had a regular fight spell, fine, whatever. But in some situations, you're just going to make your largest thing even larger, eat their best blocker, and swing in for trample damage, and that's just all of the things that needed to happen on board for you to win. So it's not a combat trick, but it has like a similar texture to what we're kind of talking about here.
So Tyvar Stand,
the love letter I could fucking write for this card.
I will say Tyvar Stand is one of those cards that looks really innocuous. It does not look like it is good as it is. Okay, so we've mentioned green gets a mana advantage really easy. Green relies on sticking a big creature and then untapping with it. And Tyvar Stand is the only card in the entire cube that basically says you are doing that. Because we don't run Sunfall, We don't run a lot of edict effects or anything like that. There are almost no ways to get rid of a card with a single spell if you have Tyvar Stand in your hand. And that's the floor of the card, is that basically it guarantees that barring multiple cards, you are untapping with the card you just played, which is probably a green expensive creature that is going to snowball a lot of value if you untap with it. The other part of Tyvar Stand is that very frequently it just does that plus a bunch of other stuff. So, I mean, one of the best blowouts I've ever gotten was like my opponent attacked and they Witchstalker frenzied my creature. I Tyvar Standed my creature to block to have the protection, pumped it, and then used the Indestructible on Tyvar Stand to also win a combat, and it was just like a clean 2-for-1. And granted, that's like kind of upper ceiling of the card, but it's just so efficient and so flexible, and it is the best protection spell ever printed. Unless you're running Sunfall or specific edict effects, you just cannot push through Tyvar Stand. And when you pair that with something that is going to get you a huge advantage on its own, something like Radagast, right? Like untapping with Radagast is one of the scariest things in the cube. Untapping with a Railway Brawler is terrifying. Untapping with a Vorinclex is terrifying. And Tyvar Stand says, yeah, that's happening.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like this is coming up in green a lot, but like we were talking about with Repulsive Mutation, in a lot of situations, like the green plan is I'm going to stick this thing. There's nothing that you have on board that can possibly like mess with this thing. So unless you get rid of it, you're going to lose. And like things like Snakeskin Veil and Blossoming Defense have seen play in cubes before, but this has the thing. And it actually, we should just again highlight that this is like a green thing. A lot of these combat tricks that are really good, or effects like this that are really good, are things that are, it's this effect, but with a big creature on board, it's also just Fireball. Right, like that's a really common theme with these cards that we're talking about. And Tyvar Stand, you know, like Teld mentioned, giving hexproof is massive. In addition to Indestructible, like sometimes both of those things will matter on the same cast. This can be, you didn't block this creature, I win the game. This can be, I blank your removal spell. This can be you double blocked, and instead of trading like 1-for-1 off the double block, I'm now upsizing this and making it indestructible simultaneously, so I'm actually eating both of your creatures in combat. It's a simple text box, but the card actually, there's a paragraph on the card with there not actually being a paragraph on the card. Actually, it's really funny. This is way more of a commentary on Nadu than on Tyvar Stand. But the other night, I tapped out for Nadu, and my opponent targeted it with a removal spell, and the top card of my library was a Forest, which came into play untapped, which allowed me to cast the Tyvar Stand. I didn't have the mana to cast, and then I drew another card, which was also a Forest, and played another untapped Forest. It was just, yeah, it was really
How's it feel being the bad guy?
Well, pretty good. Pretty good. Actually, you know what? It didn't actually feel that good. I actually it's the first time I 3-0'd in a really long time, and I didn't feel like personally responsible for that 3-0, which kind of sucked. But yeah, Tyvar Stand is great, and shout out to Doug. This was a Doug suggestion a while back.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the things about Tyvar Stand too is if like you're tapped out and you go to block, sometimes because of how many trampled creatures there are in green, like you block and die anyways. It's just like
yeah, you block and die anyway.
Yeah, the card's modality and efficiency are just through the roof. We talk a lot about efficiency too, and like trading a single mana for your opponent's removal spell on green creatures usually means you're getting a small mana advantage, but sometimes it means you're getting a big one. It's just such a flexible, powerful card. Like it is the card that kind of got the whole train rolling on playing these sort of combat tricks. I think if this card hadn't have been as good as it is, it's like it was one of those cards that you like started out, people play it in the sideboard, and you boarded it against removal heavy decks. And then you were like reluctantly mainboarding it, and then you realized it was just like literally the best card in your hand in every single matchup. And then now it's just like, okay, You should just be drafting this as like a top 5 green card.
Yeah, now I just play it. I mean, in green decks, like green decks is one of those things where it's like, I think this goes broadly for like combat tricks in general. It's like, well, if you don't have a creature in play, it's just a dead card, and it's a terrible thing to top deck if you don't have a creature on board. And that's true. But I would counter by saying that if you're in the mid game as a green deck and you don't have a creature on board, you probably already lost that game. And there are going to be in some situations where you get wrathed. and then like you top Tyvar Stand instead of topping like a threat, and that's terrible, obviously. But generally speaking, in most situations, like if you're topping Tyvar Stand and you didn't have a creature on board, like unless you were literally going to top like the best threat in your deck, you're probably already in really serious trouble.
Yeah, I mean, and so the flip side of that too is like green decks oftentimes just soft scoop to a Wrath. You almost can't beat it if you didn't have like Vivian or Nissa in play. But like what Tyvar Stand does is flip the matchup on its head. Your opponent goes to Wrath you if they're playing those still, and you Tyvar Stand your Questing Beast or something, and then you just like kill them on the next turn. It is one of the handful of cards for green that gives you play on your opponent's turn and lets you flip a bad matchup on its head. It is a game-changing card.
Yeah. So one thing actually that just kind of occurred to me that I think might be a good sort of conceptual tie together is I think in cubes, like in traditionally designed cubes like ours, one of the things about combat tricks is like most historical combat tricks, all that they do is push damage or make you win a combat. And in most situations, if that's all that the combat trick does, then, and I'm again, like there are edge cases, whatever, but bear with me. In most situations, if that's all that the combat trick is capable of doing, then it's just worse than a removal spell would have been, right? Because like the removal spell just, it does what the combat trick was going to do, except it doesn't require the combat. Like your creature doesn't have to be blocked first, etc. And removal spells, in addition to basically doing what most traditionally like weaker limited style combat tricks do, which is allow you to kind of go up a creature, removal spells also proactively deal with stuff. Like they're just inherently like way better than the average combat trick. So for a combat trick to be good in a traditional cube, it has to be able to do that, but it has to also be able to do things that removal spells can't do. Like Embercleave, like just win the game. And Embercleave is like a perfect example of kind of what we're talking about. Because like Embercleave, if you cast it and then the creature gets Doombladed and you swung out to cast the Embercleave, a lot of times you're going to end up in like pretty serious trouble. You can reassign the Embercleave, and that's fine, but most of the time what you're trying to do with the Embercleave is win the game. So if you recognize that it's like a high-risk play, but the upside is I win, then if you game that out to like its logical conclusion, what you're essentially saying or admitting to yourself or whatever is that high-risk plays with substantial enough upside eventually get there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, too, is that sometimes, you draft, like, a rock deck, right? And you get matched into a control deck, and all those Doomblades are just rotting in your hand for a large percentage of the game. They don't have great targets, because your opponent's playing, like, a handful of creatures. Even though we've seen more control decks lately playing, the lower-cost value creatures. But for most of Magic's cubes, it feels like control mostly just plays expensive, resilient creatures that are very, very difficult to interact with. And the difference is when you're playing these green decks, and normally it's a very bad matchup, but if you've got a bunch of these combat tricks, it's funny because they're cards that like kind of work as removal spells in some spots where like if your opponent has a Scarab God and they have to like block your 4/4 and then you combat trick them and win the combat, it kind of worked as a removal spell. But in spots where your opponent doesn't have anything in play for you to kill, but you can squeeze through, like Trash the Town, for example. A lot of times it gets blue decks. You can just like on turn 2 or 3, just cycle the Trash the Town as a draw 2. And that makes it substantially better than something like a bite spell in that spot, right? Because you're not going to sit there with removal dead in your hand. You actually get to convert it into something in play. And it gets control, like we mentioned, Tyvar Stand, Repulsive Mutation, oftentimes can counter like the cards that they need to catch up. Because oftentimes control is really relying on, 1 or 2 really impactful cards in their hand to kind of get them to the point where they can resolve some card draw.
Yeah. Another good example would be like Monstrous Rage, but for a different reason. So like Monstrous Rage can obviously just like upsize a creature and win a combat. But relative to a removal spell, like what it can do against, like let's say you're pushing into a blue deck for damage and they have like 1 blocker and the blocker was never going to trade with anything, right? Like a creature does not have to be upsized to win the combat, but it's going to block damage. The Monstrous Rage pushes damage by giving the creature trample, but like it also triggers your Monastery Swift Spear and your Soul Scar Mage. So like you quote unquote won the combat that you were already going to win, but like let's say that your opponent was going to survive by putting a 1/1 token in front of your 3-power creature. Well, now Monstrous Rage is pushing, if you have like a Monastery Swift Spear on board, all of a sudden the Monstrous Rage represents like another 5 or 6 damage you were not going to get in with, right? And that wins the game. So yeah, all of these cards that we're mentioning kind of like fall into that sort of concept that I was just highlighting, which is like a removal spell is going to be basically going to be universally better than a combat trick, where all it can do is win a combat.
We had a discussion with a card that just came out. It's called Fanged Flames, I think is the name of the card. It's a common from Modern Horizons 3, and it's basically Obliterate in Bolt number 2, right? It was like 1 in a red, deal 4 to something, exile it if it dies. And we talked about it very briefly on the podcast, but we had a discussion, should we be playing this as Obliterate in Bolt number 2? Because one thing we've noted is these stupid X4s they keep making are really good against aggro. They're really good against anything that needs to attack on the ground. And we just got a card like 6, too. Like, they just keep pumping them out. There's X4s everywhere. And we were like, well, what happens if we just play a bunch of cards like Obliterate and Bolt? Then does it start invalidating creatures again? You know, like if everything is just a deal 4 for 2 damage, like aren't you just pushing things in favor of red? And we decided not to play it because, you know, why have these X4s if every single removal spell is now Doomblade against them in red, you know? And we've noted that like Lightning Strike doesn't line up the same way it used to. Royal Eruption, all these deal 3s don't line up the same way they used to. And a lot of times in a draft, we would prefer to have the more efficient removal spell that deals more damage in red than the face burn that deals less damage, because you can clear a creature out of the way and then get in more damage. But combat tricks kind of help solve that issue a little bit, where instead of just loading up your cube with a bunch of removal spells that now kill everything, you know, just hyper efficient, you know, flame slashes and stuff like that, you actually get a different dynamic that lets you push through those X4s and those ground creatures without having to just, you know, fill your red section out with a million Doomblade-esque cards that just kill whatever you point them at, you know. Like, I don't think we would want every single red removal spell in our cube to deal 5 damage. But alternatively, we could play a couple combat tricks, and the combat tricks give the red decks a way to actually push past these big blockers, kill them, get them out of the way, hopefully keep your creature on board without having to introduce a bunch of removal spells that could be problematic across the board. So I like it as a nice little middle ground between like the weaker removal spells that don't clear big creatures out of the way and the big removal spells, which I feel like you need a couple of, but you don't want to overload on. Otherwise, your cube just becomes centered around like removal, killing every single creature. It's just like every single removal spell is a Doomblade. So I like these combat tricks as an alternative to that. Monstrous Rage especially, I think, is just a raw efficiency card. Yeah, we've talked about it a couple times. I don't know if we actually ever read the card here, but it's 1 mana for essentially +3/+1 and trample. But it leaves behind a roll token. I think it's called a monster. Yeah, obviously a monstrous roll token. It is Monstrous Rage after all. And you get that staying power. You get to win a combat. You get to push past a dumb creature like 6 or Priest. I guess you wouldn't push past Preacher of the Schism, would you? Because it has Death Touch. So you take my point, though. You take my point that like the combat tricks kind of give you an alternative to just playing a bunch of hyper efficient removal.
Yeah, or just like in red, like just burn too, right? Like, I mean, so many red sections, it's just tons and tons of burn spells, which makes sense. That's what red does. It plays well with prowess creatures, yada, 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 yada. But yeah, I'd love like a Monstrous Rage, like a good enough Monstrous Rage style card number 2, just because it triggers all your prowess duators. It's still good with what red is doing, but like it just offers a different texture than just like, here's my 6th shock with upside.
Yeah, I mean, and then the upside on a card, I mean, Monstrous Rage in particular has been a standout because we've played it in multiple environments, and it's just every single one of them, it's super good. Just the degree to which, like, your opponent's no longer allowed to just chump block with their tokens or whatever, it changes races in a way that I think is, if they want aggro to be good, these are the kind of cards that they need to be printing to buff up these aggressively slanted threats. I actually just think when Monstrous Rage is good, it is so much better than a burn spell that it is kind of wild.
Yeah, it's true. And like the fact that, so it upsizes the creature, but it doesn't just leave behind like basically a +1/+1 counter for most intents and purposes. It leaves behind permanent trample as well, which, as you just mentioned, like, you know, if I cast this on my Monastery Swiftspear with no other effects on board, that makes it a 5/4. But then in any future turns where I pump my Swiftspear, you can't just like Teld mentioned, you can't just throw like a 1/1 token in front of it because now it has trample. So that's going to continue on a creature like that. It's going to continue even after it already pushed damage in the first place. It's going to continue to push damage in the face of potential like chump blocks.
So here's a question for you guys. We mentioned, I think you said 5, right? We're on 5 cards that we would consider combat tricks across red and green. How many can you play in a cube? I guess is my question. Are we looking for more? Like, would we play more efficient combat tricks in line with things like Monstrous Rage if we had them? Are we at the correct, quote-unquote, correct number that we would want for the cube, and we would just replace them if we got different ones? Like, how many combat tricks can a cube support, you know? Obviously, there's diminishing returns on too many combat tricks, so there's a point at which you can't play more. It's kind of like the green cantrip conversation a little bit. But, like, would you guys be interested in playing more on top of the ones we're already playing, or do you think that we've hit that upper limit?
I think I would be cool for up to a couple more, especially if they were in red, black, or white. I think black, if we had a really, really premium one just to push with these like more aggressively slanted black decks, that would be great. The white decks don't really have a good combat trick outside of something like if you want to stretch and say like the Wandering Emperor, because you can, do the flash +1 thing. There, you could definitely fit a premium one there. I think on the kind of green side, we're getting close to the max, but like if they gave us another card on the level of Time Our Standard Trash the Town, I don't know, because like the protection aspect especially is just so good with green. It's just it is exceptionally powerful. Just most of the protection spells don't quite get over the hump of like they're bad into rats, right? Like if you're holding up a Snakeskin Veil and your opponent casts a Wrath or whatever, you're like, okay, well, this sucks. So I think they have diminishing returns there. But I think there's room for a couple more. I do think we've got some flex slots in the cube that like a combat trick in, like I said, in white or black potentially could be a cool card to have.
Yeah, I think it boils down to how modal they are, right? Like obviously the more modal they are, the easier it is to quote unquote make room because they're not eating like design equity. For me in red, I'd be down for a couple more, and I think what it really boils down to is like, are they good enough to just replace like burn spell number 17? And in green, like the through line that you're mostly seeing with these is that they either like they can upsize a lot, like they can upsize X so they can just win the game and also provide protection. That's kind of like the dynamic that we're seeing, the through line that we're seeing, which I just wanted to comment on really quick. I don't think it is a coincidence that the ones that we are playing that get there are in green and red. Weirdly enough, you would think that upsizing things in green is less relevant than it is in other colors because green things are already big, but in my opinion, it's actually the opposite. Oftentimes, green creatures are like large enough relative to other creatures or other colors creatures on board that they don't have to be upsized by that much for the dynamic of the combat that they're in to be wildly different. Like sometimes a big green creature, all it needs is an extra like +1/+1, and then the dynamic of the combat changes like so much, right?
Yeah, you go from being able to double block and lose one creature in trade to being a clean like 2-for-1 on attacks.
Exactly, right. Where like a smaller creature in another color would need to be upsized like substantially more than the green creature would. The other thing is like a lot of green creatures have trample. So upsizing them it's not just winning the combat, it's also pushing damage. So like upsizing is just kind of inherently better on creatures with trample. And then in red, upsizing creatures is inherently better on creatures that have first strike.
First strike, yeah.
Yep, which is like a really, really big deal. Not to mention the fact that combat tricks trigger prowess creatures, which is also why they work so well in red. So I think that green and red, at least with the way that creatures have been designed in Magic up to this point, and I assume will continue to be, I think that green and red are just going to continue to be the best homes for combat trick style effects because they just work the best with the qualities that red and green creatures tend to have.
Yeah, I mean, blue doesn't need them, obviously, all right? We're not playing, like, -X/-0 effects in cube environment. Black has... I mean, black technically gets, like, your Disfigure type cards, which you could certainly classify as a combat trick, but, like, I think you think of it more as removal, and then you get this, like, combat trick-esque, like, bonus if you can shrink a creature in combat and stuff like that. Plus we don't play that many instant speed like -X- effects as it stands. I don't even think we play Disfigure anymore, but you know.
No. Well, and Disfigure as a trick tends to like work best when you're getting a non-black creature into combat. Like if you're using it as a trick and not as a removal spell, a lot of black creatures are so fragile that using it as a trick isn't going to like make the creature survive the combat, if that makes sense.
Yeah. White is another color that could benefit from combat tricks, but I don't think it quite has anything on the level of Monstrous Rage yet. Plus white and black, like, they just get the clean removal spells. Like, they don't have to worry about damage-based removal, so they can just get a creature out of the way instead of having to, like, try to outsize it in combat and stuff like that.
I think I will also say, like, even though I would like a combat trick in white, I actually, what I would like more is, like, maybe another Maul of the Skyclave type card that's just, like, a really powerful equipment that just can, we can keep moving around. Because that's, it's sort of combat trick adjacent, but, like, not exactly, because it, it isn't a surprise or anything. But white benefits a lot from the stat bonuses of stuff like Maul of the Skyclave.
I would really like to see a gets there, provides some value, or has some modality red combat trick that offers first strike. That'd be nice.
Quick shot.
So, speaking of, there are a few combat tricks that I think are competitive that we don't run. I don't know if you guys have any more, but the three I thought of were Wing It from the new Modern Horizons 3 set, which is 1 in a white for an instant. It gives +2/+2, a flying counter, and scries 1. There's Dreadmaw's Ire from LCI, which is 1 red for an instant, +2/+2 trample, and when your creature deals combat damage to a player this turn, you get to destroy an artifact. And then, I don't remember the name of it, but Adventure Pig. It was one of the WoW Direct to Standard cards where it's 2 mana for +2/+2 until end of turn, and then it's also a 3/1 that when it attacks alone makes a food token for 2 mana. And all three of those are like totally fine cards. I don't think they quite get over the hump, but I've played them in other environments and they've been pretty good. I think Wing It is like close to the design I would want to see for a white combat trick, but I think the biggest problem it has is that if you're going to use it to do the combat trick thing of winning a combat, you don't get to take advantage of the evasion that the flying offers. So you have to like choose between doing it at sorcery speed and winning and potentially winning a combat. And +2/+2 on a white creature doesn't always win a combat either.
Yeah, well, Wing It does. I mean, Wing It's interesting because, like, you can give up the fact that, like, you're getting an evasive hidden for that turn because it gives you a flying counter, which means your creature will be evasive the following turn. So, like, you do get that staying power. Like, like we said, you need staying power off of these cards. Wing It leaving behind a flying counter, which, by the way, just makes it an alchemy card. Prove me wrong. I think that's fine. It is a 2-mana trick, though, in white. Like, it's basically a Mighty Leap, right? Yeah. Like, we would never play Mighty Leap. I don't think it's that much of an upgrade over Mighty Leap to, like, actually consider it over like a clean white removal spell like a Fateful Absence or something like that. Dreadmaw's Ire I think does get there if you have the type of artifacts that need to be blown up, because that's the staying power on Dreadmaw's Ire is you get to blow up an artifact. If you're not doing that, like 80% of the time in your cube you just don't have enough artifacts. This is just +2/+2 trample, which is like pretty mediocre, but still probably like fine. And then the Truffle Snout, if that one doesn't sound that good, like just reconsider. People played Rimrock Knight. I still see Rimrock Knight in like decently powered, high powered cubes, and Rimrock Knight is like okay, it's not that good, but like the Truffle Snout does give +2/+2 versus Rimrock Knight's +2/+0, and the creature half is better than Rimrock Knight, so it's just an altogether better card. And, you know, Rimrock Knight, these adventures, I wish there were more adventures that had good combat tricks on them, because that's exactly the type of staying power you would want is, oh, I can use this card as a combat trick, and then I get a free creature later on. Or I could just run it out as a creature if a combat trick's not going to be useful. So I do like Intrepid Truffle Snout. It's also fun to say. But, I mean, you don't have to go out and make a cut for Intrepid Truffle Snout in your creature-oriented thing, but it's the type of thing you should be looking for if you are interested in combat tricks.
Yeah, Rimrock Knight is a cool example of a way to like print a combat trick that gets there. Is just to put it on like a middling creature. I think that's a good way to do it. I don't like see Rimrock Knight in lists and go like, I don't know about that. I don't like it as much as the people that are playing it do, obviously, or we'd be playing it. But I think I would be excited to see like a slightly more pushed Rimrock Knight in the future.
Yeah, Intrepid Truffle Snout. It's right there.
Mm-hmm.
Just needs to be in a better color for that.
Yeah, Teld, you mentioned some tricks that you see in retail limited. Like combat tricks are huge and limited. They're, very important in limited. They can shape an environment. In fact, we've seen, was it Thunder Junction? Like, we've seen what happens when a format doesn't have combat tricks and you're pushing stats and, you're power creeping creature stats and stuff like that. It's really hard to push through creatures. You don't always have the removal spell. So, the combat tricks are the type of things that you need to push through sometimes. And like OTJ didn't really have good combat tricks. But you mentioned a couple combat tricks here that you see kind of like set in, set out that aren't quite good enough for Cube. Did you want to mention some of those?
Yeah, so speaking of OTJ, they reprinted Skullduggery, and that card and like Subtle Strike in mini sets are really, really good. Like in ZNR, if you've played that set, Zendikar Rising, Subtle Strike's one of the most important cards in the early to mid game, and Skullduggery was amazing the last time we saw it in, was it Ixalan or Rivals?
Ixalan. I think it was actual Ixalan.
And the thing both of those two sets have in common, where these cards are really, really good, is that all the creatures tend to have compressed stats. So there weren't a lot of absolutely massive creatures rolling around. There's like a reason that the Colossal Dreadmaw meme was, part of it is like, if I remember right, wasn't it very good in those sets because it was just absolutely massive relative to everything else?
Colossal Dreadmaw has never been bad. And apparently still isn't bad in Modern Magic, as it were.
But yeah, like Subtle Strike, for example, in ZNR, all the creatures are like 1/1s, 2/2s, 3/3s, whatever. So Subtle Strike is frequently going to like win a combat and then put a +1 counter on a thing, or like straight up 2-for-1 your opponent. Skullduggery and OTJ didn't quite get there because the green creature is just so much bigger that even after you Skullduggery, you're not 1-for-1ing. You're still getting, your creature's still dying in combat with the green creature, which makes that card a lot worse. And they just don't really carry over. They're just not quite impactful enough for a cube environment. They've been doing this for a while now, but the 2 mana value, like +3/+3 trample green tricks, they're kind of close, but like 2 mana is too much, and 1 mana for +2/+2 in trample, which I think they've printed one time, is also not a big enough stat bump. If they gave us 1 mana value, +3/+3 in trample, I still don't think we would be interested personally, but that would be really, really cracked in a lot of cubes.
And they just straight up power crap giant growth.
Yeah. There's Gaia's Gift, which was, it gave like a +1/+1 counter, a million keywords and stuff, as well as hexproof and like indestructible. Problem is, it costs 2 mana. These effects need to be able to have a 1 mana buyout, like for the protection spells. Holding up 2 mana for a strict protection spell, something like Gaia's Gift, that doesn't like provide enough stats or moat power, right? Like Repulsive Mutation gets away with it because you can hold it up for like 4 or 5, and then you also make a massive creature out of it. But Gaia's Gift has a pretty low ceiling relative to that. So yeah, the 2 mana just doesn't work. And then the -X, -O draw effects, or creatures that do that, are almost always awesome in retail limited, but they just don't. Blue's just not doing quite that in cube. It's just not something you're interested in. Like, we could probably run something like Wizard Trap or Take the Fall, and it would probably occasionally do something impressive. But then you're using a cube equity slot for that. I think we would only be doing that primarily for the cantrip rather than the -X effect, even if it would come up.
Yeah, I want to emphasize the protection spell thing, that they really need to cost 1 mana, because even if it's like mass protection, like what is it, heroic, not reinforcements, heroic intervention, yeah. 1 in a green instant, all of your creatures gain hexproof and indestructible, not good enough, like not worth a cube slot because it's 2 mana, even though it protects all of your creatures. A lot of times it just fills the role of a Tyvar stand anyway, because how often are you really needing to protect multiple creatures in the same combat, or against a Wrath, I guess, is the standard situation there. But yeah, we played Heroic Intervention in the past and found that it just wasn't good enough. The problem with a 2 mana protection spell is if you're holding it up, you're presumably not casting something else you could have cast because you're just holding up 2 mana instead. And then if you don't get an opportunity to actually use that protection spell, you are playing off curve and you're just lighting the extra mana on fire. And that's a lot more tolerable when it's a 1 mana spell. You can play off curve by 1 mana pretty frequently and still have an impact on the game. When you're playing off by 2 mana every single turn in the hopes that you just get to use this protection spell to save something, or use it favorably, or trade up on mana, like you can't just light 2 mana on fire every single turn. You'll fall too far behind.
it's kind of a given that like I think for a trick style effect of any kind, even if it's modal to be good, as it has to be cheap, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And while the arena kind of gives it away sometimes that you have these cards, like assuming you don't have that arena giveaway, like it's not uncommon to be like, all right, well, I'm going to cast my 4-drop and this elf that I cast, to cast a 3-drop on turn 2 or whatever. We're now a little later into the game, and like it not being able to attack and being held untapped and not spending the mana isn't like a giveaway. It isn't something uncommon to have that happen with like one elf. And so then you kind of get to sneak it in because it's unexpected. But like, yeah, once you get to like 2 mana, it's pretty obvious if you're playing cards that like, if you've got cards in your hand that the odds of them being all lands are not very high. So it's kind of like you said, it's a dead giveaway that you've got something.
For sure. I mean, that's everything we had on combat tricks here. Is there anything you guys want to say to kind of wrap things up, or any other combat tricks you really want to emphasize, or maybe final thoughts to push people to actually try them out in their creature-oriented cubes?
I think that there are more people who would like to put combat tricks in their cube than there are people that think that it's a good idea. So if you take anything away from this episode, I would hope that it is, don't dismiss them out of hand. We didn't list like a ton of them that are great or whatever. It's not like the card pool is like littered with undiscovered gems that are combat tricks. Like the heuristic that they're generally not very good exists for a reason. I guess what I'm saying is like if there's like a spoiler season and you see like a trick style effect that you really like and you think is good, like don't default mentally to it's definitely not good enough though because it's a combat trick. Like give it some actual thought, game it out in your head, and decide for yourself whether or not it's worth running.
Yeah, I would say this is doubly true if the card is like 1 mana protection spell, has an X in the cost that does something relevant, something like that. These are things that we're starting to see. Yeah, most of these cards, other thing to keep in mind, most of these cards have been printed in like the last year, right? Trash the Town, Tyvar Stand, Monstrous Rage, and Repulsive Mutation are all cards that I believe all those sets are still in standard. So like these are cards that are new additions to the card pool. This is new frontier of these like super crept power crept combat tricks that are able to provide something that is worth a lot more than their mana value would get you doing other things. And that's really the giveaway there, I think, to look for is like, look for cards that you're like, you look at the mana value and it raises your eyes a little bit. You're like, huh, that's all that for 1 mana. That seems like an excellent deal. Or all that for 2 mana, seems like a really good deal. And I would just say like, if you're really hesitant, I mean, if you have a really good right aggro deck in your cube, maybe try Monstrous Rage. But Tyvar Stand is the one that like, if you're just like going to take away, like what card would, if you had to recommend one, would I try? I'd be like, start with Tyvar Stand. Just see if that card performs, because that is the one that is the most consistent. It is the most flexible. It shows up in the most winning decks. Repulsive Mutation is amazing. It's a card we are super high on, but it's also a gold card, so I understand not wanting to run it. It has some limitations if you're in more powerful environments, but I think even in these more powerful environments, Tyvar Stand could still perform.
Yeah, and that feels like a good place to wrap it up. I don't have too much else to add other than if you're one of those people who gets the feedback that like, oh, my opponent has too much removal or something like that, you feel like you're too dense on removal, you can shake it up. Like you could shake up a removal spell for a combat trick or two and just see how it performs and see how you like it. And look, if you play the combat tricks and you don't like that tension, like I said, I like tension, but not everybody does. People like to know exactly what can happen in a combat sometimes. If you're a designer who prefers that, then yeah, maybe combat tricks aren't your style. But if you're looking to shake things up, or you've looked at one of these and you thought, maybe this gets there, but I'm not sure, people don't like combat tricks very much, then try them out, especially the ones that we mentioned here. And I have to imagine they're only getting better moving forward. Like they, like Teld said, I don't know that like they're still in standard, end quote, is like a very good determinant of like how recently a card was printed, because apparently
standard last
the
84
Wandering
years
Emperor
now
is still in standard, and that was printed in the 90s. But I get your point that like all of the combat tricks that we do play, aside from Ember Cleave, which is kind of like an all-timer ridiculous card, Throne of Eldraine Syndrome, like all of these were printed within the last year, and it feels like there's an intentional push to make the combat tricks better over time, and we are seeing them get better. With that being said, thanks as always to everyone listening. Remember, the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank podcast is to join the Discord server, come draft with us, give us your feedback. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals and talk about Cube, retail limited. You can come complain about Chris. That is Writhing Chrysalis, not actual Chris. Talk about all things Magic. And there's a lot of... we had to open up the temporary rant channel again. That was before Modern Horizons 3, but I think I'm going to keep the temporary rant channel going because Writhing Chrysalis is definitely a ranty card. But well, that'll be open. If you have some Writhing Chrysalis stories, come join the Discord and share them with us. You can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this podcast. We have a ton of scheduled drafts throughout the week. We have the mainline Jank Diver Cube. We have the Peasant Cube. We have some grab bag cubes throughout the weekends. We also have F&M style cube where people vote on the cube to play, as well as chaos drafts. So there's always plenty to do. About 6 events scheduled throughout the week, and most of the cubes that we play have been updated with Modern Horizons 3 at this point. Sans broken cards. I don't think Nadu is just like...
We should probably just find a replacement for it when we're done recording.
Yeah, we should probably never touch that card again for any cube ever.
It's going on the Imidane Recruiter like server wide ban. You know, if you put this in the cube, we just don't put your cube on the playlist.
Yeah, if I see Nadu in your list, I'm going to be like, why? You know, what are you trying to achieve here? You can check out our socials, Twitter at JankDiverGamin, YouTube.com/JankDiverGamin, where Teld has posted the Modern Horizons 3 Peasant update video. We've got our most recent podcast episodes. Remember, if you're on YouTube, just give us a like, subscribe while you're there. It helps out a lot. You can find Teld on twitch.tv/Teld Talks, TELD Talks. It feels like we're up in the air. We don't have to talk about this dumb Assassin's Creed stuff coming up, so we've got plenty of time until Bloomborough hits in like August, I think. So we've got some freedom to do some new topic episodes. We'll talk behind the scenes about what we'll be discussing on the podcast until Bloomborough hits. But
yeah, we're gonna kind of put this challenging heuristic series, I think, into the same bucket as like the Build a Cube. That like when we feel like talking about that particular topic, we'll just bring it back up, and this will be some sort of long-term recurring series.
Yeah, we could talk extensively about fights and bites too. I think Chris and I actually did an entire fight and bite episode in the old Deep Dive podcast. But that would be the type of thing that falls into this bucket as well. The type of cards that people are loath to play in Cube because they have kind of a traditional stance against them, but we find that there's room for them.
Or perhaps we could talk about something like Savannah Lions that people are still way too high on as a whole.
Yeah, that discussion's coming at some point. I don't... we got to have that discussion at some point. But yeah, that's going to go ahead and do it for this episode. Thank you all to the listeners, all the daddies out there. Have a good Father's Day, and we will catch you all next time. Teld, you got to sign off?
I do. So, yeah, Modern Horizon sets are... They tend to be sets that they reference a lot of Magic's past. They tend to be kind of a love letter to the game, and they get us feeling very nostalgic and thinking about our time with Magic. So with that said, I wanted to know from you guys, what's a card in each color that like you just kind of associate Magic with? Like, what are the cards that when you think about them, they just kind of get you dreaming about the game? They make you really nostalgic. So for mine, I've got 2 white cards. There's Core Skyfisher, which everybody knows I love, and then Sun Titan, which is was one of the first competitive cards I played. One of the early... I came in around the time that Scars of Mirrodin block was going, and I just played Sun Titan for like that all the way through Innistrad and just had a lot of fun with like the blue-white Caw deck after Jason Stoneforge got banned, and then played like the Sun Titan control with Phantasmal Image decks, and I absolutely love that deck. Speaking of Innistrad, my blue card is Snapcaster Mage, because while I think that card has aged a little bit, I played that card for about 2 years straight through Standard. Like from the time it was printed, I'm pretty sure every deck I played was just a Snapcaster Mage deck until it rotated. My black card is Gary, Grey Merchant of Asphodel. I played a ton of mono black mid-range when I was playing a lot of Constructed Standard. That card was just like such a sweet one, and it was nice to see a common just be like one of the best cards in the format. That was super funny. Red is Lightning Bolt. I know that's kind of a gimme free space that like Bolt makes people nostalgic, but people never thought Bolt was going to be reprinted, and it kind of was in Standard when I started playing, and I didn't understand how good it was, but every time people would talk about it, they were just like kind of confused as to how a card that good got reprinted. People would splash for it all the time. Heuristics Studies actually has a video on Lightning Bolt, and I think it's a really, really good one. It's one of his best. And then finally, my green card is Swag Tusk. For those who played with it, you always need to carry a second spear, and be afraid of Thragtusk into blink spells because, man, that is brutal.
Thragtusk Resto, that used to be the thing, right? That was before my time, but that used to be the thing that people were doing, the cool thing.
Yeah, it's one of those funny spots where, kind of like Siege Rhino, you hated it when it was happening, but now you look at like modern constructed Magic and it just has you longing for a time a long ago.
Chris, you got any thoughts on this? Cards that make you nostalgic?
In red, it's Ball Lightning, because I remember when that card came out. Yeah, I just liked the art. I don't know why it sticks out in my mind, like it's not a good card, but yeah, I really liked that one. And then for black, the name of the card currently escapes me. It's like the namesake card of the original Rock deck.
Is it the Delve card? It's the black, like Delve for like a 5/5 flyer?
No, it's like the art's really gross. You like sacrifice another creature to give another creature -1/-1.
It's Phyrexian Plague Lord.
Yeah, that one. Let me see if I can pull the card up. I played like green kitchen table piles when we were kids, and my brother always liked like creepy black card art. And yeah, Phyrexian Plague Lord. This was one of the first ones that he was ever like. He really loved the art, and I thought it was super creepy because he was like 7 and he thought this was really cool. Yeah, those are the two big ones, probably. I mean, neither one of them are cards that have stood the test of time or anything, but...
No, Plague Lord actually used to be a decent commander card not too long ago, but I think you don't really see it too much these days. Ball Lightning, I don't know the last time I saw a Ball Lightning, but Ball Lightning's a very evocative card. It's a very cool card. I do love me a Ball Lightning. I thought about it a little bit. I had a card that I picked out for each color for different reasons. For white, Wingmate Rock came to mind. That's the Khans of Tarkir, like Super Bomb. Pretty cheesy to use like the Super Limited Bomb as like a nostalgic card, but I started playing Magic in like 2013, 2014. Khans came out in 2014, I think, maybe 2015, I don't know. But Wingmate Rock was in the first deck that I ever 4-0'd an FNM with. So, like, I just remember, like, the first time that I trophied an FNM, got first place. That deck also had a Torrent Elemental in it, which is another absurd bomb, but it does take me back to the old FNM days. Blue is a little card called Grayscale Gariel, and I would give you guys, like, $20 right now if you could tell me what that card was, but I don't even... I think it's a blue mana for a 1/1 with Island Walk. And that's it. It's from like old Ravnica. I've never played with this card. The reason it brings back memories is because I used to have this giant industrial tote of Legos. And for some reason, there was a Grayscale Gariel in that tote of Legos. So like every time I would build something with Legos, it would just be this Magic the Gathering card that I never acquired. Like I have no idea how I acquired it, where it came from, but it was just sitting around in this tote of Legos for some reason before I even played Magic.
That flavor text is immaculate.
Oh, what is it? I really don't. I've never played the card. I don't even know where it came from.
So it's each tooth carries enough bacteria to kill a person in a day or two. But then Gariels do have 138 teeth.
That's great. Oh man, remember flavor text? That used to be great.
I do. Actually, I just found another card that makes me nostalgic.
Go for it.
Just the art, Breeding Pit. You guys remember this one? Yeah, look it up. The art's really
tokens
gross.
Or something.
Yeah, the art's really gross. It's really old school, and it's hilarious how bad this card is now. It's 3 and a black for an enchantment, and during your upkeep, you bury this. Just to give you an idea of how old this card is, you bury Breeding Pit unless you play black, and at the end of your turn, you make a 0/1 black creature. So it's a 4-mana enchantment that has like a black upkeep every turn that just makes a 0/1 on your end step. It's so bad.
Wait, that sounds amazing. Hold on a minute. There might be something. Oh, Fallen Empires.
Yep. Real old.
Man. You guys have been playing Magic way longer than I have.
Yeah, I find it funny because like it's always interesting to see like what makes you nostalgic. Because I noticed all of mine are cards that were in that like when I first started playing Magic, it was just all constructed, and so like there's that period of like the original Zendikar through like Return to Ravnica or Theros that I just like was playing a ton of constructed, and so that's where all of my nostalgic memories for the game started, right? It's just funny seeing like yours is like from a Lego box. I don't know. It's really it's really funny like just seeing like what parts of Magic made you really nostalgic.
Yeah, I really just like I I was like, okay, red, what comes to mind first? And like whatever the first card that popped into mind was the thing that I wrote down. Like for black, I think you mentioned Gary. I also mentioned Gray Merchant of Asphodel, which is funny because I didn't read your answers until I wrote mine down. And we both just landed on Gray Merchant, but I'm a Theros junkie. Like my green card here is Sedge Scorpion, another Theros card, the 1/1 Death Touch for green. I love Theros. It's what got me into Magic. Like that was a great period of time, me just like exploring Magic and stuff like that. And Gray Merchant was like the first common that I remember being like, why is this a common? That sort of thing.
Yeah, really sweet
Sedge Scorpion, like new player syndrome, 1/1 Death Touch for 1. How is my opponent ever going to beat me with a bunch of Sedge Scorpions? I would have like 5 Sedge Scorpions in all my limited decks.
Sedge Scorpion always gets his man.
I would die to flyers. And I'd be like, I don't understand why my deck full of Sedge Scorpions and Combat Tricks isn't working. I could talk about Theros all day long. Don't get me started. My red card, I just really briefly wanted to mention, it's a card called Kavu Aggressor, and I could not tell you what it does. I know it's a Kavu with kicker. It has art that is burned into my head for a very bad reason that I'm not going to get into right now. Like, that's a whole different story that I just don't want to touch. It's not a very good story. But when I think of red cards, like when I think of Magic the Gathering, I think of being a child and my relation to Magic the Gathering. Kavu Aggressor is the card that comes to mind. Couldn't tell you what it did, but that is a story for another time. But yeah, it's mostly Theros cards versus like random cards that popped up in my childhood before I was even a Magic player. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to attend our Modern Horizons 3 final design meeting. As you all know, the set ships tomorrow, and we have to start pushing advertising for Assassin's Creed and Bloomborough immediately. But there's still that matter of our last red-green common to fill in Modern Horizons before we can send out the card file. Now, if you'd all rip that line in front of you, we've got about 3 minutes to design this card. Anyone want to throw out any ideas? Yeah, well, it's a green card, right? So it should probably have reach.
Oh, reach for sure,
reach
baby. I love
great.
reach.
Yeah,
man. Fuck flyers.
Whew, yeah, that's great, guys. Yes, of course, all green creatures need reach these days. What else y'all got? Well, I was thinking, like, what if it was, like, impossible to attack through? Like, it made a bunch of bodies and got, like, really, really big and stuff. Yeah, you might be onto something there, Jimmy, so, like, it makes an Eldrazi spawn when it ETBs.
How about 2 Eldrazi spawn?
Yes. 2 Eldrazi spawn tokens, so no one can ever get through on the ground. That's good. Ted, what do you want? We're in the middle of making a card right now. Why are you raising your hand? Hey, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just a little worried about this design so far. It seems like having that sort of power in a gold common could lead to some cluttered board states pretty quickly. Plus, this would be a common that's difficult to attack through and ramps you to your 7 drops way ahead of curve. Wouldn't that be hugely problematic for the format?
Hey, man, fuck you, Ted.
Yeah, Ted, what are you, stupid?
Dumbass Ted.
Yeah, get this man out of here. Don't you know Magic players love board stalls? Market research shows that longer games make players engage with the cards for longer periods of time and causes them to develop emotional attachments to the cards, which in turn makes them play longer. It's like Stockholm Syndrome, but magical. Anyway, we've got a 4-mana 2/2 that makes 2 Eldrazi's on ETB. Come on, hit me. We've only got a few minutes left. 2/3, make it a 2/3.
And make it a cast trigger so they still get the Eldrazi even if it gets countered.
Hey, what if it only triggered twice per turn? No. We've already blown that text on Nadu. We don't want to overdo it. We're expecting a positive community reception for Nadu, so we want to make sure the text is unique for that card. Ooh, pick me next, pick me. Yes, Timmy the Hammer Johnson. Did you have something to add to our design? Yeah, what if we secretly made it show up in packs more frequently than other commons, but never told the populace about it so more people got to play with it? God damn it, Timmy. That is why they call you the Hammer. Good thinking. Thanks, sir. I'm just doing my best. All right, last order of business, we need a name for this masterpiece. Remember, it's going to be an Eldrazi, so it needs to be a fairly ambiguous name evocative of a plate of spaghetti with a squid on top. Calamitous Calamari.
Subwoofer.
That don't quit. Writhing Chrysalis. Ulamog's secretary. Hey, wait. Everybody else shut up. What was that you just said, Timmy the Hammer Johnson? Writhing Chrysalis, sir? God damn it, Timmy, I love you. Alright, there we go, people. Writhing Chrysalis, a common 2/3 reach for 2 red-green that makes 2 Eldrazi spawns on cast. And just for good measure, we'll let it get +1/+1 counters whenever you sack an Eldrazi. Just a little something extra, probably won't be huge. And right in the nick of time, we've got to send this card file out. I cannot wait for the player feedback, guys. I think we hit a home run on this one.